call out to me again. He calls me river, I call him the wind. He's been holding me close, singing me to sleep. We cut through mountains, make our way to the sea. Oh, I thought I'd seen it all, but this place I've never been. He calls me river, I call him the wind. He said, lay me down in the ground and let your water drown me. Lay me down in the ground and let your water drown me. He calls me river, I call him the wind. He calls me river, I call him the wind. He calls me river, I call him the wind.
Yat A, guests, friends, and relatives. Sha'e ashihin shlent, tachini bashashin, tabahidashache, kinplachini dashanele, Sha'e Apryl yanishia. Greetings, everyone. My name is Apryl, and I am Dene from the Navajo Nation. I'm currently calling in from the traditional homelands of the Tohono O'odham people. I'm a program manager with Native Governance Center. Native Governance Center is a Native-led nonprofit that supports Indigenous changemakers and nations. We encourage you to learn more about our programming by visiting our website, nativegov.org, or by following us on social media at nativegov. Ehyat to everyone for joining us today for this virtual event on Language Matters, how to talk about Native nations. Our event will provide you with an overview of terminology related to Native nations, in addition to showcasing the wide range of opinions on language within Indian country. This topic resonates with me personally because as Indigenous people, our history, cultures, and languages continue to be erased and threatened. Using appropriate terminology acknowledges, supports, and uplifts Indigenous peoples, our sovereign nations, and ultimately leads to a healthier and prosperous future for all. I don't know about you, but I'm really excited for today. A few housekeeping items I'd like to recommend is to submit questions for our Q&A portion using the Q&A box on Zoom or the comments section on Facebook. We'll transition to Q&A at 4:15 p.m. Central Time. This event is being closed captioned. You can turn on closed captioning if desired using the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Finally, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors. Thank you to Anderson Realty and Bremer Bank for helping making this event possible. And thank you to API Group, a market-leading business services provider of safety, specialty, and industrial services for supporting our 2021 virtual event series. We're going to start today's event with a short presentation on some terminology basics. We'll follow it up with a panel discussion. In this short presentation, I'll briefly explain why language matters and some basic do's and don'ts when it comes to talking about Native nations. I want to preface this to say that many of these topics are complex and could be their own webinar. The panelists will dive into these topics more, but as always, we encourage you to do your own research and to tap into the resources shared at today's event. So why does terminology matter? At a base level, it's about respect. Using appropriate terminology shows respect for Indigenous people, nations, and cultures. It is also about sovereignty. Our organization helps Native nations strengthen their sovereignty using appropriate terminology. To talk about Native nations raises awareness about Native nations' sovereign status. The more people who understand this, the better outcomes we'll see for Native nations. It is also about narrative change. Indigenous people are tackling invisibility and stereotypes head on through the Native narrative change movement. The movement seeks to create change across sectors through accurate representations of Indigenous people. Using appropriate language contributes toward accurate representation. Over the years, we've received many questions from members of the community about terminology. We know you have questions and we're here to help. This conversation benefits us all. So you may have asked yourself, Native American, Indigenous, American Indian, which term is the most appropriate to use? These terms can all be used interchangeably. Everyone has their own preference. If you're writing or talking about a Native individual and you're not sure which term to use, ask them what they prefer. Also, the Native American Journalists Association recommends using that person's specific preferred tribal affiliation, we'll talk more on that later, over a more general term like Native or Indigenous. For non-Native folks making general conversation about Native issues, Native Governance Center recommends using the terms Indigenous or Native American. We always capitalize the terms Native American, American Indian, and Indigenous. This shows respect for the fact that these are both racial and political identifiers. Major media outlets and style guides have adopted and are starting to adopt these capitalization rules. There are 574 federally recognized Native nations that share geography with the United States. They are independent nations within a nation. Make sure to use the term nation to show respect for tribal sovereignty and the fact that Native nations have their own systems of government. For example, 11 Native nations share geography with Minnesota Mukoche. Some mistakes to avoid: don't use a reservation or a casino name to refer to a nation. These are not interchangeable. Some Native nations operate casinos, and many Native nations have reservation land, either their ancestral land or land they were forcibly removed to by the United States government. But these names are not the same as a Native nation's name. We'll use the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe as an example. The Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe operates Grand Casino. The Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe calls the Mille Lacs Reservation home. Do not refer to the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe as the Grand Casino Tribe or the Mille Lacs Reservation Tribe. On another note, don't mash together several signifiers for Native nations. For example, don't use tribe and nation together, such as Red Lake Nation Tribe. It's redundant. Red Lake Nation suffices here because that's the official name. For example, Red Lake Nation is implementing language revitalization efforts. Finally, avoid possessive language when talking about geography. For example, don't say Minnesota's 11 Native nations. The nations are separate from Minnesota because they are independent nations. So this is confusing. When you're not sure about which name to use for a Native nation, look up the nation online. Use the name they call themselves on their tribal website. Always capitalize the names of Native nations. It is also very important to note that Native nations also refer to themselves in their Indigenous language, which may or may not translate to their English name. Overall, naming is complicated. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's important to note that Native nations are operating with names that they did not originally choose for themselves. So we encourage you to learn more about the history behind why many Native nations are currently working to change their names. You may have seen the term Indian country before, and you may be wondering whether it's okay to use it. So what does this mean? According to the Native American Journalists Association, Indian country is both a legal term and has popular usage. It's used in Title 18 of the US Code. In popular usage, it refers to Native nations, lands, and areas with large Native populations. You can say something like, Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland's confirmation was a monumental day for Indian country. At Native Governance Center, we use the term Indian country when we talk about Native nations. And as always, capitalize Indian country when you use it. Because Native nations can decide for themselves how to govern and determine their membership, Native Governance Center refers to a nation's membership as its citizens. This is similar to saying citizen of the United States. In this case, for example, we'd say they are a citizen of Red Lake Nation. You may also hear the term members or enrolled members. Enrolled here refers to people who have met the criteria for citizenship as defined by their nation and have completed the process of becoming a tribal citizen. Enrollment is a complicated issue and we'll save that for another day, but know that using member or enrolled member is also acceptable, and you may see Native nations refer to their citizens as such. Again, this is just a small sampling of terminology related to Native nations. Even within Indian country, terminology preferences are incredibly diverse, and you'll probably see this demonstrated during today's panel discussion. This presentation is by no means comprehensive. It's just to get you started. So the good news is there are so many great resources out there if you want to learn more. Listed here are a few examples, plus we'll be releasing a terminology guide in the near future, so stay tuned. If you learned something from this presentation, or if you learned something from these resources shared today, please consider compensating Native people for their time. Make a donation, and better yet, make a recurring monthly donation. So now we will transition over to the panel discussion, and I'd like to welcome and introduce Native Nation Rebuilder, Native Governance Center Board Chair, and our host for today, Dr. Twyla Baker. Dr. Baker will kick off our panel discussion. So I'll kick it over to you, Twyla.
Awesome, thank you, Apryl. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really fortifying to see so many people in the attendee list, and I know that this is going out live right now, so there's plenty more people that are interested in the discussion that we're about to embark upon. My name is Dr. Twyla Baker. I am the board chair of NGC, and I am also the president of Nuata Hirata Sahnish College, which is very relevant to what we're about to discuss here. The college is the Tribal College of Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, which is the home of the MHA Nation, also known as the Three Affiliated Tribes. Try saying that, 5 times fast. It's really awesome to be sitting here with the panelists that are in attendance with us today, and we're going to be getting into some of the discussion around identifiers and appropriate terminology, and just getting a taste of what the thought is around names. And names are very important things. So I'm going to start off with, excuse me, Weezy, would you take a second to introduce yourself?
Hamitakepe iha chantewashtenape chuzapalo Wizipan emachapalona Sichagula kota hemachana Ashke Gluipi Tioshpai Emataha. Greetings, everyone. I greet you with a good heart. My name is Wizipan, and I am Sichago Lakota, or our colonized name is Rosebud Sioux Tribe, and I am a citizen. And I come from the We Wrap Our Hair band of the Sichago Lakota. Really happy to be here.
Thanks so much. It's great to have you here. Okay, next we're going to move over to Margaret YellowBird. If you could introduce yourself.
Nawa wetstagune kutatha staragashtakanu Margaret YellowBird kutatinaga natsudaga datita sahnishna witatanu na sananat. Hello, everyone. I am Margaret YellowBird, and I said it was a good day today. I'm happy to be here. I am from MHA Nation. I'm a Rikra Hidatsa, and I'm also the Sahnish, MHA Sahnish Culture and Language Coordinator. And then I also am the White Shield Arikara or Sahnish Culture and Language Teacher. Now from MHA Nation, we had established 3 years ago, the tribe had established a language program and we're the product of that. So the language program is a mentor apprentice program and that's what I work for. So as a coordinator, my job is to help develop language teachers. And with that note, again, how few in between we are, I'm also sitting in that position as well as a language and culture teacher. So thank you again. I'm very happy to be here with Goshted. Thank you.
Awesome. Welcome. Welcome. We're very happy to have you. And next we'll move over to Bryan Pollard. Mute, Bryan.
I had to be that guy. Theo, I'm Bryan Pollard. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm an associate director of the Native American Journalists Association, associate editor of the Indigenous Affairs Desk at High Country News, and a John S. Knight Fellow of Journalism at Stanford University. I'm also the former executive editor of the Cherokee Phoenix.
Fantastic. It's great to have all three of you here to discuss this topic. I know this is something that I get asked a lot. And we're going to move into some of the questions. I really liked how Apryl kind of segued us in. The other thing to remember about a lot of this stuff is that it's evolving. It's also evolving, and there's change-ups that happen. So it's important to check in with Indigenous people and Indigenous tribal nations, and we're the ones that get to decide all this stuff. So it's important to be on top of it. I'm gonna just pose one question to the full panel and let you guys jump in with your thoughts as you will. The first question in regards to terminology is, why does using appropriate terminology matter for Native people and nations?
Okay, you all don't jump at once. I will go first. I guess I think it's very pertinent. It's important to our representation, just flat out. It's very pertinent to our representation of who we are as Indigenous or Native American people, however you want to describe yourself as. I also think that making sure that we educate. Education is so important. It's very key. And it's not only just education for non-Native people, it's also education for our youth, our people, what terminologies to use. So it's not just for a particular people, it's for all of us to really get on the same page and be unified in that way as Native people, so that when we come to events like this or other events in public or wherever it may be, that we're all very cohesive.
I think that, so language is sacred, and in many Native traditions, in Judeo-Christian traditions, and in many spiritual traditions throughout the world, the earth and the universe, the creation story, sometimes creation begins with a word, or else there's a moment in history or time when naming occurs, right? So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God brought all the animals before Adam and Eve, and and they named them. In Lakota traditions, that same kind of thing happened whenever we became human and we emerged onto the earth as humans. And we got to choose the names for all of the animals. And so it becomes a sacred act of creation. And, you're not even considered to be a human. Like there's every culture in the world, like you get a name, you're called something, and your people is called something, or you refer to yourselves. And so your identity is tied up in whatever that name is. And it's incredibly important. And names have the power to create life, or they can take life. and all you got to do is read court decisions, you know, in terms of like what can happen there. You know, there's this example around Indigenous peoples in UN documents, Indigenous peoples capitalized I, capitalized P versus capitalized I, small p, and it actually has a different, it has a completely different meaning, and there's like these big arguments around this. And then, you know, like again, language is so powerful, and it tells our stories and directs like who we are and how we view ourselves. And you know, for example, right, we're Lakota, but everyone calls us Sioux, which is actually a two words, right? It's an Anishinaabe word combined with you know, Nadawesi or Nadawesi combined with French word pluralized S-I-O-U-X becomes Sioux, which is actually a derogatory term, right? So it's like, and we call ourselves this. So it has that meaning. That's like one aspect of why it's so important.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's a sign of respect, and also an acknowledgement that a people have the inherent right to identify themselves in their own terms. And from a journalistic perspective, it's also about accuracy. When you are describing somebody, you need to understand how they identify themselves, how they identify their connection to their community, and you know, how they describe their tribe or the sovereign nation that they're from, because those are all very important and distinct identifiers that the greater population or the greater public needs to know in order to understand that all of our communities are distinct. They all have their unique identity. And you show respect by being accurate in how you describe people.
Awesome. Weezy, it looked like you had a question in the chat in regards to the upper versus lowercase, the significance of that.
Right. So up in uppercase I and P refers to Indigenous people as groups that have distinct legal rights. So, for example, the Indigenous people of Lakota, that means we would have jurisdictional rights. We would have the right to hunt and to issue permits over hunting, versus capital I lowercase p, which refers to individual rights. So me as an individual would have certain rights, and most Indigenous groups that I've interacted with have always said, we also, while we have individual rights, yes, but we also have collective rights to land, collective rights to jurisdiction, etc.
I've also had a similar conversation around the word native, and capitalizing the N in native, being native people, as opposed to like small n native plants. It makes the distinction between human beings and something that's an object. So I think that's an important thing to make note of. Thank you for that. I'm gonna jump to question number 2. We know there's a huge diversity of opinion in Indian country when it comes to terminology such as Native American, American Indian, Indigenous, and Native Nation or tribe. What are your opinions on these terms and the surrounding conversation? That's a big question. So Margaret, do you want to start?
Yeah, we'll just keep going in order. So that is a huge topic, and I honestly, it seems like everybody has their own preference. That's what I've noticed, like going around in Indian country. That's kind of what I see. Is you'll see, in this area they prefer Native American, or here this is where we prefer Indigenous. American Indian, I know that's something that we see a lot on our census, or when students are applying and they gotta apply for title programs, you're going to see American Indian more commonly on those types of forms. And again, it goes back to, again, educating yourself again. Indian, do we use that term for ourselves? We say it for Indian country, but for us to go and speak to other people, non-native people, and encourage them to say Indian might be something that more we would be opposed to, because we're not from India. So, and it goes back to that. I also believe with this being said, like our terminology, it also goes back to when we look at these mascots, you know, Indians, the chiefs, the things like that, and what kind of a negative narrative has it set for us as Indigenous people or Native people. So, I mean, again, that terminology, I think for us, again, it's that's a big subject right there. What do you choose to, what do you say? And I know, like, even for myself as a preference, I told you who I was in my language by my tribes. And so I teach my children the same thing, you know, as a teacher, you know, you can do this, this is okay. And, you know, saying that you're from this nation, these are all good ways to express who you are as a Native person or Indigenous person. And again, that's another preference on whether or not you want to say Indigenous or Native, because it does go back to that argument for people that are say, well, I'm born here too, so that makes me Indigenous, right? Or I was born here in this state, so that makes me Native to this state. So there's that confusion that comes up for when it comes to this conversation. But from my experience and from what I feel comfortable with, again, is acknowledging I am Native American. I describe myself by my tribes, and I do acknowledge my nation that I am enrolled in or a citizen of. And that's a discussion that I definitely do have with my children in my classroom and my own children, or anyone, if that's a conversation that they have questions about, because that has come up with our students, especially our high school students, because they're curious. They're wondering, what do we say? And that even goes back to like First Nations people. Well, why is that different? Why are they different? So these are these good discussions that our students have, and they're good conversations to have. So yes, very big. And that's my opinion. That's from my experience. Thank you.
I'd say ditto, like yes. And then just kind of add that each of the kind of generally accepted terms kind of have it's not like set in stone, but they kind of have like a more nuanced, more specific meaning, right? So, you know, Native American generally is what you would say is more of an ethnic term, you know, although it's not always used as, you know, you can say Native American tribe or a member of a Native American nation, but it's kind of more ethnic. American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian have very specific legal definitions, right? And so we say, oh, I'm American Indian, you know, so you use it in the same way as it says Native American, but from a legal perspective, a federal Indian law perspective, that has very specific meanings. You know, if you're talking a bunch of Indians, we probably call ourselves Indians, right? Like, you know, that's just how we talk, man. I've never gone to like one of my cousins and be like, oh, hey, you're Native American. I'm like, hey, you're just Indian, right? Like, so that has a meaning. That is kind of, you know, we've interpreted and brought it, you know. Then there's First Nations, which typically refers up to people up in Canada. Then there's Indigenous, which typically includes any people that live, that are indigenous to that land, and that, you know, are still continuing to live as closely to their original ways of living, right? And typically you would say, oh, they're tribal people, right? Indigenous people of Africa, or indigenous people of New Zealand, whatever. And then there's tribe or tribal. I'm personally opposed to the use of the word tribe and tribal, because of the way it's been used and weaponized against us throughout history, and the way it continues to be used in mainstream society, right? So you hear political commentators talk about, oh, you know, Trump is talking to his tribe, the Trump tribe, meaning people that think like him. Or in business, You need to market to your tribe, meaning the people that love your product. Or and so the word gets trivialized and less meaning attached to it. And that's why I say, well, let's just stop using the word tribe. Let's strictly use the word Native Nation and other terms.
Yeah, and even when describing divisive politics, they say that they're being tribal in their politics. You know, we always encourage people to describe people by their tribe or their nation. That's always going to be their original source of identity. And so that's going to be the most accurate and respectful way to describe them. Native American and American Indian, I think, largely are kind of interchangeable, but really should only be used if you're talking about people from multiple tribes. And so you might talk about a Native American issue in the sense that it affects a large number of nations. Indigenous, I think that, you know, in journalism, that term is starting to be brought into greater use. And it's to describe mostly Indigenous communities, both within and outside of the United States. And so Native American and American Indian really are used within the US. You find First Nations in Canada. And then if you want to kind of describe all of the Indigenous peoples of North America or around the world for that matter, then you might use the term Indigenous. But we always encourage people to refer to people by their tribe or their tribes.
Great. Yeah, it's very individual. Even what Margaret was talking about, there's a diversity within tribes too. And I think we are kind of arbiters of our own issues at times because, well, we do things kind of as this large conglomerate. And of course, that's going to be a little bit confusing to the folks who aren't within there. But there is an enormous diversity, and I can't stress this enough. There's an enormous diversity of tribes and Native nations throughout the United States, all over the world, really. I mean, there's Indigenous people all throughout the world, even within just one nation. Speaking for MHA, there's three here, all with distinct languages, and even within the languages, there's distinct dialects. So it's a lot to we don't. I mean, for me as an educator, I don't expect people to know the minutia, but at least have a little bit of understanding of that. And folks are actually dropping some really good questions into the Q&A section, and we're fielding those a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the multiple names that nations have, and that's due to the fact that some of us bear names that weren't of our choosing. Or there's references to the like the parcel of land that we happen to be gathered upon, Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and things like that. So it comes from a lot of different sources. Do you guys want to talk about the diversity of names that exist within like one nation?
So I was just going to add to that quickly, Twyla, when you were talking about that diversity portion of it, it's not even right now, it's not even just the tribes itself, like, or the nations themselves, or what people you are from. So there's another thing. What people are you from, right? It's not even just that. It's also, how do you identify yourself? This is one thing that I started noticing even with students, the younger students, is how do they identify themselves, especially when from MHA, we do have those three nations. So some of our students are those three nations or two nations plus Dakota or something else, right? And so what I find is when I come in and I speak to the kids and we're learning, you know, Sahnish, and we're having class, some of them will say, but I'm not Sahnish, you know, I'm not Arikara, I'm Hidatsa, because that's what I'm learning. I'm learning to speak that language. So they identify themselves that way now, you know. So that's another thing to think about, is that our students now, our young people, and, you know, even some people are identifying themselves only with one nation. not with their multiple nations. So that's one thing that I've actually started noticing more often, especially with the youth.
Yeah, I think that the diversity is always can get really tough, and it's compounded by colonization. And you know, just speaking for us, you know, everyone says, "Oh, Great Sioux Nation," and that has some legal terminology too, and it means something big. But really, what that refers to is what we call the Ocheti Shakonwi, which means 7 council fires, and which is an alliance of 3 closely related groups: the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. And there were 4 representatives, 4 Dakota tribal representatives, 3 from Nakota, 1 from Lakota. Together, we created one big nation. But then the Lakota are further subdivided into 7 bands as well. And then each one of those bands is then further subdivided into what we would call Tioshpai. And again, we kind of call those bands as well. And the main political unit was actually your Tioshpai, not necessarily how you identified and leveled up. And then through colonization, you know, the Great Sioux Nation, the Ocheti Shakonwi tribes, we all get split up into like 30 reservations down in the US and in Canada. And so then we adopt the name of our officially federally recognized Indian tribe. So then I'm like Rosebud. Well, Rosebud refers to the place where the agency was located, and they called it Rosebud because it was on a hill with a lot of rose bushes. And so roses are sacred to us, and they mean something, but it's actually a colonial term given by the Milahanska Oyate, which is actually our term for the United States, which means long knives, right? So also this works both ways in terms of language, right? So now our language and what we call people are descriptive. So imagine what it represents to be called the nation of the long knives, and how we still identify that. So again, it gets really complicated. Each group is unique. It's best to learn that. One of the things, my last kind of thing I'll say is, I'm always getting asked, "Oh, how do you say your name?" and this and that. And if it's in the rest of the outside world, I don't care. I'm like, you know, happy to explain everything. But it gets really frustrating when I go to the post office and they're like, Wizipan, and I'm like, you live here. You know, we've been here for thousands of years, and you've never taken the time to try to learn our language, even the basics. And I'm like, you know, I give them all like right information. Like, here's our college. You can take language classes to learn how to do this. You know, but it's constant. It's constant, especially if you have an indigenous language name. You're constantly explaining it.
Yeah, it is complicated, and it's the same has happened with my tribe. Oftentimes these things can be even more complicated by how colonization has divided the community. My tribe, the Cherokee Nation, we were originally one people in Georgia and North Carolina. And then after removal, we were forced from our homeland into Indian territory, where we then became, we were a tribe, but because people came over in different waves, there was conflict. And so now there's actually 2 Cherokee tribes in what was Indian territory, which is now Oklahoma. And there's a tribe in our ancestral homelands in what is now North Carolina, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And so even though we were one people and we all come from one people, we're now 3 kind of federally recognized tribes. And so it's important for people to understand those distinctions. And that's why I go back to the recommendation that you need to understand how somebody identifies themselves, because that's going to be really the most accurate way to describe them, because these things are complex, but everyone has their own sense of identity. They know who their people are and where they come from. And that can be their tribe, and it can be their community within their tribe.
Awesome. This is all amazing discussion. I'm gonna, first one thing, I think, and it's stuck in my head, Wizy, you were talking about the popular usage of terminology. and how we refer to ourselves within closed circles. Even that happens in like popular ways too. Like the term Indian has evolved into NDN, the three letters, you know, when we're talking to each other, at least through social media, texting, or things like that, you know. So again, it's evolving, you know, it changes and we adapt and whatever. So it's that stuck in my head. Now, this is probably the $1 million question here, and I'm sure a lot of folks are probably waiting for something along these lines. But if you could pinpoint one key mistake or piece of inappropriate terminology that folks should avoid when talking about Native nations, what would it be?
Ooh, okay. So this one I've been thinking about, and I'm like, what would be the best answer for this one? But the one thing that I think that when I really sat down and thought about it, one terminology I think that could be a change maker or something that we really need to think about, and we keep saying it right now through this whole panel, we've been saying the word nation. Instead of saying reservations, nations, there's so much more power behind the term nation versus a reservation. So like right now, North Dakota passed the bill for SB 2304 for teachers to start teaching Native American history through K through 12. And I think that's something that's going to be very pertinent to change with that narrative, that verbiage, that how we say it. Instead of saying reservation, it's a nation. And that's going to help a lot of students, people understand. And that goes to that respect part about it. Respect that we are a nation within a nation, that we do government to government work together. So I think that this one, that was the one I really thought about this one. And that one was probably the number one for me. Was I would love it if we stop using that term reservation and start using the powerful term, a nation.
I would 100% agree, and just add a story. A couple of years ago, we had some summer interns, you know, and they were awesome, and you know, we put them to work, and we had some of the folks, you know, doing janitorial work and mowing, groundskeeping, and so one day we fed them every day, but you know, we bought them pizza, and I sat down with them and I'm talking to them, and I was telling one of the young ladies, I said, you know, I'm really glad and happy that you're doing this, because you know, when grandma pulls up to our building and she sees the grass that's nice and neat and mowed and that there's no trash anywhere, I said, it makes her feel good. And this girl was 15, and she responded by saying, yeah, it makes you feel like a white person, and you're not from on the res. So her definition of the res, and we always, when we say this, is like, oh, stop acting resi, or you know, oh, I'm going back to the res, or I'm gonna res out on you, right? Like these terms of like means dirty, less than, you know, crazy, not rational, like all those are terms, and we adopt that, and so the language and the naming of the language is so strong that young girl, her definition of what it meant to be on her own nation's homeland was less than everywhere else. And that's why it's so important.
I think the mistake that we still see way too often in media is referring to an individual as a Native American. It may seem counterintuitive, but I would say that that's actually a form of erasure. To refer to an individual as a Native American, it strips away their unique identity. It strips away their culture. It strips away their language, their history. And it's also, frankly, irresponsible and bad, poor journalism. And people need to be referred to by by the nation and the community that they belong to, and it needs to be referred to accurately, because you reinforce their identity, you reinforce their history and their language and their shared identity. And so it's something that we still see today, which is confounding to me. But mainstream media really needs to stop referring to individuals as Native Americans, and they need to identify their communities.
I feel that that's powerful. It's always empowering when you hear, and I see it in the community when somebody is referred to by their nation as opposed to just generic Native American. You know, so that's very powerful. Although I do want to make sure that folks know that you're going to come across vestiges of the old language, you know, consistently until that language changes. I'm thinking about Indian Country Today, one of our largest media sources. What we were talking about earlier in regards to American Indian, Alaska Native, those terms exist within research too, and are used relatively consistently still. So those vestiges are still there, and they're probably going to be hanging out a little bit longer until something better comes along. So, or until the vernacular changes. So, which people are working on. Okay, I'm going to move over to some of the Q&A that came through, and there's some good questions that were popped up. I think you guys have been fielding them in the chat too, but the first one I'm going to ask is, should non-Native, non-Indigenous people learn Indigenous languages? Also, is it respectful to say greetings or thank you in the language of the people you're interacting with? Anybody wants to jump in?
Okay, I'm gonna give this one a whirl. Should non-natives? Oh, this is a tough one. Should non-natives learn our native language? As a language teacher, culture and language teacher, I can see the pros and cons both ways. I can see how that's our language. It comes from our people. It's for us. It's a healing. It's medicine. It's our identity. It's everything who we are. It's our creation stories. It's everything. That's who we are as our people. So I can see where that's for us. On another note, when we talk about revitalization and the efforts of revitalization for languages, sometimes we're not so lucky or fortunate to have a nation's member or Indigenous member from your community that can speak or know the language. So there are where we have to outsource. And so that's kind of where here, for where I'm at, for Sahnish people, we don't have fluent speakers anymore. When I was a little girl, we had fluent speakers. I remember hearing the elders speak. I remember them. There was a small convenience store here, and I would go help. My grandparents owned it, and I remember them coming in and sitting there speaking in Arikara in Sahnish and having coffee, or they come tell me what they wanted. I never knew what they were saying, you know, and now we don't have that anymore. And so it's very heartbreaking. And we did have to outsource for a linguist that has been working with our language, who is a non-Native person and has been working with our language for 13 years now, knows it better than any of us. And so we run into those situations. So I can see the pros and cons of that question, but coming from a nation and a people where this is our revitalization efforts, I'm not opposed to a non-Native person, because that's where we are right now with our language. We need that person to help us, and they just helping us get started. But then that's where our mentor apprentice program is supposed to be, where we take that on ourselves. And that's kind of what a lot of language programs offer, and a lot of language programs kind of go through.
Thank you for saying that. I think it's entirely appropriate to use greetings, and just like we were talking earlier, say the name properly, learn how to say it. It's a respect thing, and if you have respect and care for somebody, an individual. All my kids have our traditional names, and I think I saw a meme or something going around about talking about little kids correcting people every single time. Correct them every time. Make them say your name properly, you know, because that's the name that Creator gave you. So it's a respect thing. It's a respect thing. I think it's lovely when I hear my language when I'm sitting in a Denny's in Minot, North Dakota, you know. So guys, if you want to jump in, yeah.
I would just add that, you know, I'm not sure I can answer the question whether non-Indigenous people should learn Indigenous languages. But I would say that if they do, they need to try to get into a community or a household where the language is spoken, because language is not just words on a page or words on a recording or words on a website. Language is people, language is community, language is culture. And there's much deeper meaning behind it besides just what you see written on a page. And so anyone that's trying to learn a native language needs to make every effort to get into a community to really understand what's behind the language.
I think it's contextual, right? Like, you know, my dad's white, or was white, he passed away, you know, lived here. It was absolutely expected that he learn as much of the language as possible. You know, my Hunka father, you know, we pray with non-Indians, and it's expected that if they're going to participate in our ceremonies, that they follow our rules, and that also requires them speaking our language in certain instances so that they understand the nuances and the concepts that we're talking about. I think the big thing is power. And so my Hunka dad, he's a medicine man, and he has two rules. He says, one, non-Indians never speak for us. They can, if they speak for us, then that's wrong. We speak for ourselves. And then two, they can never lead our ceremonies. They can participate with us, but they never lead our ceremonies. Now, other groups, other people have different rules, and those are their rules, but that's our rules. And so, you know, if you're a hobbyist and you're, you know, in Europe, Germany somewhere, and you're learning Lakota language and, you know, practicing our ceremonies without our permission, that's not a good thing. You know, but if you're here embedded, living in the community, and you've been invited to participate, that is a good thing.
Awesome. I think you kind of made reference to like the diversity of thought too. That is something that I've mentioned before. There is a diversity of thought within communities. There is no great big a governing board of Indians that you know says, okay, well, we're going to say this and we all agree. You know, that makes absolutely no sense. If the folks who are listening who are non-native can think of in terms, is there somebody that speaks for all white people? No, there's not. So, you know, it's diverse here too, because we are individuals, we're individual nations, individual, you know, histories and all of that type of things. There's a huge diversity of thought. So there might be people that disagree with our panelists. There might be people who agree vehemently, you know, so it's a lot of different things. So I'm going to actually pose one more question here. And again, this is probably another one of the ones that folks have been kind of waiting for in regards to this topic. What advice or action steps can you recommend for folks who want to learn more about appropriate terminology for talking about Indian country and Native nations?
Well, right here, right now, what we're doing, this is the best place to come, right on this panel, to hear what we have to say. There is plenty of resources out there. Native Governance Center, NIEA, the National Indian Education Association. We could go on and on, but really, I think when it really comes down to it, I like the when we were first getting into it, like Googling, Google that nation, and I'm sure, and you can call their tribal office. Call their tribal office. You can definitely get in contact with their culture. A lot of them have culture and language departments. Or even at like their colleges as well. They do have amazing programs that they can go to outsource and find out that information. But just don't stop there, just continue. And I think the number one thing, just like what these gentlemen just said earlier, immerse yourself. immerse yourself in that community. Go visit, go take the time to acknowledge that land and those people. And really, really, if you really want to know the correct terminology to use for them, they'll let you know. The land will let you know. So thank you again for letting me answer, and I'll let somebody else speak.
And just quote that, put that on a wall. The land will let you know. Give me chills. What I would say is, we're talking about language. Use the power of your voice to amplify Indigenous voices, right? So when we get a situation with like Santorum, go to Naja, listen to Bryan. What are they saying? And okay, there's only 3 million, American Indians, who identify according to the census, whatever. But not much of us, but there's a whole bunch of non-natives out there, and use your voice to help be an ally and to amplify whatever our messages are.
Yeah, and I would say, there are a lot of resources available, and I would always point people to our website at naja.com, because we actually have published a series of guides that give people advice on terminology and many other things when it comes to Native people and Native nations. So seek out resources, particularly resources that are being provided by Native-led organizations, because they're going to be the authorities, and there's a lot available out there.
I think that's really important that you made note of the seeking out the resources in particular, because there's lots and lots of resources that have already been printed that are available to you at the stroke of a key. Do your research, do your diligence. It's like I don't think any of us could argue with the fact that it's a incredibly politically fraught time, and it's very emotionally stressful for people of color all over the world, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And there's a degree of emotional labor that can sometimes be demanded from people, and that's not good either. It's if you're coming, we can usually tell, like I can tell if somebody's coming with good intentions with their questions and things like that, but I can also tell if somebody just wants me to go and do their work for them. So I would encourage folks to go and do your work, go and do, look into the resources that are already out there, and then come with discussion and with a good heart, and you'll learn. And hopefully this time that we've had here with our amazing panelists has been an opportunity of that nature for you all. I am so thankful to have you guys here, and thank you so much for sharing of yourselves and of your knowledge, and for everything that you do for your communities. These folks are embedded in their communities and within their people, so they really know. These are some rock stars that you guys are listening to today. And I think that kind of brings us to the end of the panel questions. So I am actually going to hand it back to Apryl. Thank you so much again, you guys, for your time.
Well,
yes, yeah. Wow, so much knowledge was shared today by our panelists, and the information, their perspectives, opinions, and experiences. I hope that all of you attending today will take these as gifts and do something really positive with them as you all move forward and continue to educate yourself about Native nations and Indigenous people. So ehiahet nitsago to our panelists, and for those of you who attended today, we hope you feel inspired to continue learning about how to talk about Native nations and share this information with others. If you learned something today and enjoyed the event, please consider making a contribution to Native Governance Center. You can visit our website at nativegov.org to donate. Additionally, we'd like to hear from you. We'll email a survey out to our Zoom attendees, as well as post a link to our survey in the Facebook comments. Please make sure to share your input so that we can continue evolving and growing our virtual event series. Please stay tuned for our future events. We plan to offer our next event in the late summer of 2021. I wish all Native nations and communities across Turtle Island and beyond good health, wellness, and protection. Until the next time, take care. Hakone.
There's gotta be some hope. There's gotta be some hope. There's gotta be some way for you to send your dogs away and to leave the land alone. It's gotta be a crime somewhere